He didn't resist, yet an elderly black man was yanked up mid-trial and shoved out of court in front of everyone. "No one here cares about black men quoting the law," the cop sneered. What he didn't know? That man was a former strategic advisor for a top-secret federal security program. 30 minutes later, 6 black SUVs pulled up and the FBI stormed the precinct. Think your badge gives you the right to humiliate someone who will stay silent forever? Think again. Watch till the end to find out who really holds the power and who's just hiding behind a uniform. In the packed courtroom, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the linoleum floor and the polished wood of the benches. It was just another civil case, at least on the surface, a medical malpractice suit, the kind that dragged on with expert testimonies, charts, and jargon that made even seasoned jurors zone out. The plaintiff's lawyer, a man in an ironed gray suit with a voice trained in theater, paced deliberately before the jury. According to Section 6, Clause C of the 1994 Healthcare Accountability Act, he declared, flipping through a set of laminated documents, his tone reeking of practiced authority. In the back row, a figure shifted. Not much, just a slight movement. An old black man, seated alone at the farthest bench, lifted his chin. His coat was plain, too warm for the room. His hands were folded, right over left, just below his ribs. Eyes still, like 2 pieces of old glass. Clouded, but not dull. When he rose, it wasn't with any ceremony. He stood as if he had done it 1,000 times before, in 1,000 rooms more important than this one. No urgency, no hesitation, just stillness breaking into motion. "You just misquoted Section 6, Clause C of the 1994 Act," the old man said. His voice was low, textured like it came from a throat that had once spoken too much and then learned to speak only when necessary. But it carried, not loud, not shouted, just undeniable. It landed with the force of something out of place, and yet completely The room stalled, not stopped, just stalled, like a machine catching a breath before continuing. The lawyer froze mid-step, his hand still hovering near his folder. The judge, a weathered woman with sharp features, blinked and looked down at her notes, then up again, her brow creased. The bailiff turned, jurors exchanged confused glances, and then, slow as oil on glass, the tension uncoiled. "Who said that?" the lawyer snapped, eyes scanning the gallery. He didn't look directly at the old man at first. It was as if his brain refused to believe that interruption had come from someone sitting where the observers sat, someone who didn't belong. But then he saw him, just standing there, not moving, not retreating, just standing with the poise of a verdict. "You... what?" the lawyer stammered. "You cited the act wrong," the man repeated. "Section 6, Clause C, deals with federally certified emergency triage protocols, not the diagnostic margin of terror framework you're using. You're referencing Clause D. That was when silence truly took the room. The judge's pen stopped moving. The court reporter's fingers hovered above the keys. The opposing attorney's face went sheet white. The room didn't breathe. A courtroom was a place for noise. Lawyers argued, judges interjected, papers rustled, whispers tickled the edges. But now, nothing. At the edge of the room, near the double doors, Officer Grady shifted his weight. He'd been leaning against the back wall, arms crossed, eyes half-lidded, with the smug disinterest of someone who thought they'd seen it all. He straightened. His uniform creaked faintly at the seams. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. Then, louder, leaning to his partner, "Some old fool trying to look smart." The partner didn't reply. Grady's gaze fixed on the old man now. There was something in the way he stood, not confrontational, not apologetic, just there, like a monolith. Like he'd already stood there long before anyone else entered the room. Like he'd watched generations rise and fall and forget. "Another one of those types," Grady mumbled. "Thinks quoting a law makes him somebody." The old man didn't react. His hands remained folded. His gaze remained calm. Not challenging, not combative, but direct. So direct it bypassed ego and spoke to something deeper. "You got a law degree, Grandpa?" Grady sneered from across the room, raising his voice now. Still no response. The judge, finally snapping out of her trance, cleared her throat. "Sir, you'll need to take your seat," she said, with the forced composure of someone trying to control a situation already beyond her. The old man gave a small nod. He sat back down with the same quiet dignity. No further comment, as if he had said only what was necessary, and now the weight of the moment belonged to the rest of them to carry. The room didn't resume so much as it stumbled back into motion. The lawyer fumbled his papers, hesitated. "Let the record reflect the correction," he muttered, not meeting anyone's eye. The judge tapped her gavel once, not a full strike, just enough to remind the room it was a courtroom, not a theater. But the energy had shifted. The illusion of control, of narrative, of authority had cracked. All because a man no one knew had spoken with a truth no one could deny. In the back, Grady squinted at the old man. There was something off. Not just the interruption, the certainty, the composure, the way he didn't flinch. Grady didn't like it. Didn't like being made to feel small in a room where he wore the badge. He leaned toward his partner again. "We're gonna have a word with this one after this session." The partner hesitated, then nodded. The trial limped forward, but it no longer had its rhythm. Every argument now came with the specter of that voice, that correction. Like a ghost had entered the proceedings, unseen but felt. And through it all, the old man sat, back straight, hands folded, eyes not watching but seeing beyond the walls, beyond the people, beyond the moment, as if history itself was listening, as if justice had taken a seat in the back row, just waiting for someone to remember it. And it had spoken, only once, but that was all it needed. The echo lingered longer than anyone wanted to admit. The silence that had stretched like a taut wire through the courtroom began to hum again. Faint, uneasy, dissonant. Papers rustled. The throat cleared. The judge's gavel hovered in the air, her eyes flicking from the plaintiff's table to the far end of the gallery, still visibly shaken by the disruption. But before she could issue any instruction, before the echo of the correction had fully faded from the wooden walls, a shadow detached from the perimeter. It was Grady. His boots struck the floor with a deliberate force, his badge catching the light as he cut a path toward the old man like a blade through soft cloth. Behind him, his partner hesitated, then followed. "You stand up in my courtroom? Who the hell told you that was okay?" Grady's voice cracked like a whip across the benches, slicing through the murmurs that had begun to rebuild. His tone was loud enough to carry, loud enough that no one could pretend not to hear, and sharpened to ensure it left a scar. He didn't ask for answers, he demanded compliance. This was his space, his system, and in his eyes the old man was a smudge on the surface of order. The old man didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply looked at Grady, eyes steady and quiet, as if he were peering into a reflection that had disappointed him one too many times. His hands remained clasped, resting with the same ceremonial stillness that had unsettled the room earlier. No defense, no apology, just presence. Grady stepped in close, too close, and jabbed a finger toward the old man's chest, but stopped short of touching. "I asked you a question," he snarled, venom leaking from every syllable. "You think this is a damn town hall? You think you just get to stand up and run your mouth?" His voice dripped with disdain, but there was something else buried beneath the anger. Fear, a discomfort he couldn't name. This man wasn't shouting back, wasn't shrinking. He was simply watching. Still, the old man said nothing. Grady's lip curled. He reached forward, grabbed the man by the elbow and pulled, not roughly, but firmly enough to make a scene. "Let's go," he barked, dragging him from the bench. The old man rose with him, as if allowing it, not resisting but not yielding either. His body moved, but his gaze stayed locked on Grady, a gaze that made the officer's skin feel a degree too tight. And then the man spoke. "Where did you study criminal law?" he asked, voice low, even, and impossibly calm. It wasn't a question. Not really. It was a blade cloaked in velvet, a mirror thrust in Grady's face. The air collapsed inward. A hush fell so sudden it made the walls themselves seem to lean in. Every head turned. Even the judge's mouth parted slightly. Grady laughed. But it wasn't a laugh born of humor. It was sharp, derisive, hollow. "Oh, you've got jokes now?" he spat. "I studied where people like you don't get to stand up in the middle of a federal proceeding and spout bullshit." The venom in his words was pure, uncut, designed to humiliate. Racism wasn't laced in. It was the knife's tip, the whole weapon. It wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration of territory. Still, the old man didn't flinch, and that made it worse. Grady's fingers tightened on the man's shoulder. He shoved, harder this time, guiding him toward the exit as if expelling a contagion. The courtroom held its breath, but no one moved. No one stopped him. No voice raised, no objection filed. Injustice wore a badge and walked on polished heels. The judge's gavel never dropped. The man said nothing more as Grady steered him through the courtroom doors, his steps unhurried, his dignity untouched by the force imposed upon him. His hands remained in front of him, one resting gently over the other, a symbol of restraint so profound it eclipsed the aggression that dragged him. But if anyone had looked closely, truly looked, they would have seen it, the slight tightening around his eyes, the subtle flex of his jaw. Not resistance, not defeat, something else, something dormant but watching, like a storm memorizing the layout of the land before returning. Outside the courtroom, Grady exhaled hard through his nose, like a boxer between rounds. He didn't understand why his chest felt tight, why dragging this man out hadn't brought satisfaction. He didn't understand why the man's silence echoed louder than any scream would have. "Who the hell does he think he is?" Grady muttered to no one in particular, eyes narrowing. "Just another relic who thinks the world owes him." But even as he spoke, some part of him knew he was wrong. Because power doesn't always speak. It doesn't need to raise its voice. Sometimes it just stands, unmoved, and waits for the room to catch up. And today, in that courtroom, it had. The echo of footsteps lingered in the corridor like a fading drumbeat, each step less about movement and more about presence. The old man's soles struck the cold stone tiles with a rhythm that wasn't rushed but exact, each tap deliberate, the silence between them speaking more than words ever could. His silhouette stretched before him, long and unwavering under the sterile lights, as though even the shadows knew to follow him respectfully. Behind him, Officer Grady's grip clenched tighter, jaw stiff, breathing shallow, dragging the weight of confusion and resentment down the hall like a rusted chain. There was something infuriating about the way the old man walked, neither defiant nor submissive, simply steady, as if he carried a compass inside his spine. He didn't fight the hold on his arm, didn't speak. He didn't have to. His restraint was louder than any resistance. Grady shoved him forward once, not violent, but rough enough to remind anyone watching who was in charge. The glass door at the end of the corridor loomed larger with each step, its frosted surface glowing faintly under the fluorescent bulbs, a gateway between public spectacle and private scrutiny. Every courtroom had one, an exit not just from proceedings, but from appearances. Through that door lay the unpolished guts of the system, the holding areas, the unmonitored corners, the places where respect had no audience, and power forgot to wear its mask. Grady was breathing harder than the walk required. His eyes darted sideways once to check if his partner was still following. He was, a few steps behind, quieter, unsure whether to keep up or hold back. The tension radiating from Grady was undeniable now, vibrating through the hallway like heat through pavement. The old man didn't look at either of them until he did. They were a yard from the door when he slowed just enough to make Grady tighten his grip. That was when he turned his head, not fully, just enough to offer profile and glance, and said in a tone so calm it felt surgical, "Charleston, right?" Grady blinked. The name hit harder than the question. "What?" he barked, suddenly, as if startled by a sound only he could hear. "I've seen your face before," the old man said, quiet, never stopping. "You were younger then. Same eyes, though. Same mouth when you lied." Grady's steps faltered. His grip loosened just slightly. "You were watching me?" he asked, voice dipping into suspicion. "No?" the man replied. "You were watching me." And with that, he stopped in front of the glass door. Grady's hand, still gripping the old man's upper arm, tightened again. "What the hell are you talking about?" he muttered, though the tone had lost its sharp edge. It was no longer threat, it was self-defense. The old man turned, this time fully, his eyes locked on Grady's, no longer simply calm, but piercing, like sunlight through magnifying glass, like a man who'd waited years to look into this face again, not for vengeance, but for recognition. "Not Charleston," the old man said, letting the words drop with precision. "You were there in 2006, the federal hearing. You stood in the back, and when the judgment came down, you dropped your head. You knew it was wrong, and you said nothing." The hallway contracted. For a moment, everything tightened. The lights above dimmed without dimming. The air thickened without moving. The sound of fluorescent buzz turned inward. Grady didn't blink, didn't speak. Behind them, the young officer's voice cracked the air like breaking glass. "What's he talking about?" "Shut up," Grady snapped, voice too fast, too raw. The old man didn't even look at the rookie. His focus remained pinned to Grady, not with aggression, but with weight. A stare like a monument, like a verdict, like a name long denied finally returning to claim its place in the record. Grady didn't speak as the door clicked shut behind them. The sound echoed down the hall, sharp, final, like a sentence delivered. The corridor beyond was narrower, more claustrophobic. Pale gray walls closed in. The air smelled like dust and old air conditioning. A sterile, institutional stillness. No court, no audience, just naked authority. It should have been his domain, but somehow, with every step, Grady felt like he was the one being led into a room he couldn't control. The old man walked half a pace ahead now, not pulled, not shoved. He moved like he knew the building better than its blueprints. His back straight, arms relaxed, shoulders set with the quiet command of someone who didn't need to prove anything. Every inch of him said, "I belong here." Every inch of Grady said, "I don't know why that bothers me." Grady swallowed and tried to shake off the growing tension. "You're full of it," he muttered, too loud for the room they were in. The sound of his voice bounced off the walls and came back hollow. "I've worked 100 hearings. I don't remember every old man I see in the gallery." The old man didn't respond, just walked. Silence was his reply, but it wasn't indifference. It was deliberate, and it made Grady angrier than if he'd been insulted. They reached a T-junction. Grady jerked his chin toward the right hall. "That way," he said, already moving. The old man turned with him. No resistance, no comment. The younger officer behind them stayed silent now, his earlier question swallowed by the weight of something he didn't understand. As they passed under another set of security lights, Grady glanced sideways again, searching the man's face for something, fear, guilt, maybe a crack. He found none. Instead, the old man spoke. "You know what stayed with me from that hearing?" he asked. Voice low, nearly conversational. Grady didn't answer, but the tension in his shoulders spiked. "You stood there, hands behind your back, just like you are now," the old man continued. "You didn't look at the defendant, you looked at the floor until the verdict came down. And even then, you didn't blink, but you lowered your head, just a little." "I didn't lower anything," Grady snapped, but the words rang too fast, defensive, fragile. The old man tilted his head. Not in argument, but in quiet confirmation. "You did, and you knew what it meant, but you stayed. You kept the badge, and you told yourself the system would fix itself." Grady stopped walking again, this time in front of a metal door with a keypad lock. He turned toward the man, nostrils flared, voice like frost. "I don't know who the hell you think you are, but you're not going to psychoanalyze me in a goddamn hallway." The old man didn't flinch. He looked directly into Grady's eyes. Voice still low, still calm. "I'm the man you forgot, but I remember you." The door beeped and unlocked. Grady pushed it open harder than necessary, as if force could erase everything that had been said, but it didn't. The words followed them through the door like heat. The room beyond the door was smaller than expected. Windowless, ceiling low. A flickering overhead bulb stuttered in the corner, casting light that was never steady enough to be trusted. The walls were beige, peeling slightly at the corners. lined with an institutional ugliness that no amount of repainting could fix. It smelled like old metal and antiseptic, a room made for waiting, not talking, a room where people were processed, not heard. Grady gestured toward the bench along the wall. "Sit." The old man didn't move, not immediately. Instead, he turned slowly to face Grady, hands still relaxed at his sides. He looked at the bench, then back at Grady, eyes unreadable. "Funny," he said, voice like gravel layered with smoke. "You tell a man to sit like he's a dog, and then you wonder why he doesn't bark on command." Grady's lips curled. "Sit," he repeated, sharper now, more bark than command. He stepped forward, closing the gap, asserting what space he could still control. The old man sat, not because he was told to, but because he chose to. The distinction was subtle, but it changed the air. He adjusted the sleeves of his coat, folded his hands once again in that same posture as before, right over left, fingers calm, almost meditative. He wasn't folding under pressure, he was holding something in. Grady hovered for a moment, then stepped back, pacing once across the width of the room. The younger officer stood near the door, pretending not to listen, but listening to everything. 2006, Grady muttered. "You keep bringing it up like it meant something." "It meant everything," the old man said, "to the ones who couldn't speak, to the ones who weren't allowed to sit in the front row, much less stand up." Grady stopped pacing. "You think that hearing was about justice?" he scoffed. "It was a political stunt, a damn stage play." The old man tilted his head. "A stage play where real blood got spilled. You think because the curtains closed, the story ended?" Grady turned sharply, eyes flashing. "You don't know what I've done." "I know enough," the old man replied, his voice no louder than before, but now edged with something steel-hard. "I know what you looked like when you watched someone take the fall for a system you helped protect. I know the kind of silence you practiced until it became second nature, and I know what it cost others every time you chose to say nothing." A pause, thick, heavy. Even the flickering light seemed to dim under the weight of it. Grady's jaw clenched. He looked at the man, then away, then back again. "You want to play judge now, is that it? Dig up ancient dirt and act like it still matters?" The old man didn't blink. "It matters because it never got buried. Just ignored. Ignored by men like you. Until the ground starts cracking." The flicker overhead buzzed again. The bench creaked faintly under the weight of unspoken history. The younger officer shifted his feet. "Grady," he said, unsure, "maybe we should—" "Out," Grady cut him off. "No room for doubt. No room for a witness." The door closed. The room shrank. Grady stood still for a beat too long. The door had barely latched behind his partner. Yet already the silence inside was suffocating. It pressed in from the walls like heat without fire. The old man didn't look up. He sat perfectly still, hands clasped, eyes low, not in submission, but in calculation, as though watching time, not Grady. Grady paced. One step, two. The floor under his boots creaked. Old tile giving just enough to remind him that some foundations weren't as solid as they appeared. "So what's your game?" he asked, more to himself than to the man. "Show up at a trial you weren't summoned to? Interrupt a federal proceeding? Spit out some quote from a law book like you own the damn court?" "You're angry," the old man said, not as a question, as a fact. Grady stopped, turned slowly. "You're damn right I'm angry. Because I remember," the man continued. "And you don't want to." Grady stepped forward. "I don't care what you remember. If you were part of that hearing, you were nobody. You sat in the back, just like now. No badge, no title, no authority. And yet, I'm still here," the man said. It landed like a challenge, like a truth Grady didn't have a retort for. "You think I haven't seen men like you?" Grady snapped. "All talk. You crawl out when it's convenient, start moralizing when the room's too polite to stop you." The old man looked up, slow and precise. His gaze was no longer gentle, no longer patient. It cut clean. "I stood up because no one else did. I stood when you stayed quiet. I stood then, and I'm standing now." "You're sitting," Grady spat, tone sharp. A long pause. "Am I?" the man asked, and somehow that simple question erased all the noise in Grady's chest. The officer took a breath, but it didn't go all the way down. "Tell me what this is really about," Grady said, lower now, almost unsure. "You knew me, you remembered, but I've never seen your name in a report. No ID, no record. You're a ghost." "No," the old man replied softly. "I'm the man who watched you bury your conscience, and now I've come to collect." Something about that sentence stripped the air out of the room. Grady's fingers twitched, half reaching for the radio clipped to his shoulder, then stopping. The movement betrayed him. He wasn't calling for backup. He was stalling. He was trying to slow the fall. "You're bluffing," he said, but it didn't sound like certainty. It sounded like desperation dressed up in uniform. The old man stood. The motion was smooth, unhurried. His shadow stretched again, long across the floor, the same way it had in the hallway. He didn't step forward. He didn't threaten. He just stood. That same posture, unshaken, immovable. And in that instant, Grady felt it again. He wasn't facing an old man. He was facing a reckoning. And reckoning doesn't raise its voice, it just arrives. The silence hadn't left Grady. It followed him into the precinct, clinging to the back of his collar like a scent he couldn't wash off. The hallway lights buzzed overhead, too white, too clean, slicing the space into hard rectangles. This was supposed to be his ground, surveillance systems, data on demand. But today, even the familiar hum of the terminals sounded like judgment. He sat in front of the main console, fingers tapping keys with practiced authority. Last name unknown. First name blank, alias nothing. He glanced through the reinforced glass into the holding room. The old man was seated on the bench, leaned slightly back against the concrete wall. Harsh light carved across his face, accentuating the cracks in his skin like a topography of silence. He looked like someone who had learned to outlive noise. Grady initiated the facial scan. The algorithm ran, cross-referenced, bounced across federal servers like a bloodhound. Then, no match found. He frowned, ran it again, still nothing. He pulled up the biometric grid, submitted the facial scan to military archives, criminal records, DMV databases, passport systems, nothing. One by one, each result flashed back sterile and empty. No name, no alias, no birth date, no flag. It wasn't that he was a ghost. Ghosts left cold traces. This man left none. He stood up, motioned to the tech officer. "Full fingerprint scan, run everything." The officer complied. The old man didn't resist. He placed his hand flat against the scanner, steady as though it were routine. The machine pinged once, then twice. The data ran, the cursor spun, and again, no match found. Grady felt something twist in his gut. He leaned in. "Do it again," he said, quieter now. Another scan. Same result. The light in the holding cell cast a harsh rectangle over the old man's chest. He sat as if the floor had grown from beneath him. His body was still, his breath steady, but his presence unavoidable. Grady pushed open the door to the room and stepped inside. The door closed behind him with a click that echoed too long. He stared down at the man. "You've got no record," he said, voice low but cutting. "No trace. That doesn't happen. Not anymore." The old man didn't look up. "We ran every system," Grady pressed. Nothing. Now the old man lifted his head. His face was quiet, not smug, not taunting, just centered. "Not finding a name," he said slowly and clearly, "doesn't mean I don't exist." The words weren't defensive, they were final. A rookie officer, watching through the glass, leaned toward Grady. "What do we call him?" he asked, hesitant. "What's his name?" The old man's head tilted slightly. He spoke again, his tone measured, soft but sharp enough to cut through concrete. "Those who know don't need to ask. Those who ask don't need to know." The answer dropped into the room like ice water. Grady stared at him. He didn't blink. He didn't move. His authority meant nothing in this moment. The system had failed to place this man, and Grady could feel the walls inching inward, a little more with each breath. Outside, the terminal kept blinking. Inside, the old man didn't move. No name, no number, no entry. But everything about him said, "You know who I am," even if the system The silence wasn't passive anymore. It pulsed. It clung to Grady's uniform like dust he couldn't brush off. The precinct, usually humming with predictable white noise, now felt like it was holding its breath. Monitors blinked. The hum of the cooling fans in the data room buzzed just a shade too loud, and across the glass partition, the old man remained in the holding cell, perfectly still. He sat with his hands resting loosely on his knees, head slightly bowed as if deep in thought or far beyond it. The overhead light hit the sharp ridges of his face, making him appear carved from stone, not born of flesh. Grady turned away from the window and stepped back into the communication alcove just as the internal landline rang. The sound was sharp, sterile. No one used that line anymore. Everything ran through dispatch. Encrypted, wireless. This one, hardwired, internal, was legacy tech. It only rang when someone knew exactly where to reach. He stared at it, then picked up the receiver. "Detective Grady." A pause, then a woman's voice, calm, calculated, and absent of emotion, spoke 4 words. "Where is he now?" Grady blinked. "Who is this?" Another pause. The voice repeated the question. "Where is he?" The phrasing wasn't casual, it was clinical. Grady's tone hardened. "If you want answers, you give a name first." But the response came back cold. "If you don't know who he is, detective, then the problem isn't him." Then the line disconnected. Clean, instant, final. No click, no delay, just silence. Grady stood there for a moment, the receiver still in his hand. He placed it back slowly, eyes narrowing. The air felt different now, thinner, somehow. As he turned toward the holding cell feed on the monitor, the screen flickered once, then went black. No static, no error code, just absence. He moved quickly to the keyboard. "Reset feed," he barked to no one. "Manual override, camera 4. The keys clacked. Nothing happened. A junior tech from the far end of the room called out, voice uncertain, "Sir, that camera—" It didn't crash. It was cut. Grady turned. "Externally?" "No. Internal override," the tech replied. "Whoever did it used admin-level protocol. I've never seen the string before." "What string?" The tech leaned closer to his screen. Voice hushed. "It's tagged OB7. Grady's stomach turned. That wasn't a city clearance. Wasn't federal either, not one he recognized. His fingers clenched into a fist before he turned and strode out of the data room. The hallway outside seemed longer than before, the lights humming louder, the corners darker. The air held weight. Every step hit the floor too hard. He reached the holding cell, pushed the door open. The old man was still seated, still motionless. Still commanding the room without lifting a finger. Grady stepped in, his voice clipped. "You had someone call this station. They didn't give a name, but they knew you were here." The old man didn't respond. "The security feed is gone," Grady continued. "Not failed, disabled. Internal protocol, admin level. Still nothing. You know what OB7 is?" Grady asked, jaw tight. The old man looked up at him. Slowly, calmly, then he smiled, barely, not wide enough to gloat, just enough to make it worse. Grady stepped forward. "Who the hell are you?" The man exhaled, not loud, not amused, just controlled. "You keep asking like it's going to make a difference." Grady didn't answer, couldn't, not immediately. The old man leaned forward, letting the shadow from the light behind him slide across the floor like a tide. "Let me ask you something instead," he said. "If the system you believe in doesn't know me, then what makes you think it still knows you?" Grady's breath caught. The monitor in the control room blinked again. Black, and the room, once full of systems and surveillance, suddenly felt like a tomb, one he might have just stepped into by mistake. The air inside the holding room had changed. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was the way the silence had become structured, controlled. A presence unto itself. Grady stood just inside the doorway, unsure whether to cross the invisible line that seemed to separate him from the man sitting calmly against the back wall. There was something maddening about that stillness, about the fact that the old man hadn't moved, hadn't so much as flinched. Even after the call, even after the cameras went dark, Grady stepped in farther, his boots striking the linoleum with the kind of authority that didn't feel as firm as it once did. His eyes swept the room, not out of caution, but because his instincts no longer trusted what they were seeing. He was losing his grip, not just on the situation, but on the narrative. Then he saw it, a glint of metal, subtle, but not accidental. The old man's left hand rested on his knee, the fingers slightly curled inward. On the ring finger was a silver band, dull, aged, but intact. It caught just enough of the overhead light to shimmer with something more than ornament. Engraved into the surface, barely visible unless one looked closely, were 3 numbers, not stylized, not decorated, just raw, inverted, carved backwards. 701. Grady narrowed his eyes. He took a step closer. "What's that?" he asked, voice dry. "Thrift shop relic? Or did you pull it off someone you forgot to name?" The old man looked at him, then down at the ring, and back up again. "That's not a question. That's a reach," he said calmly. Grady tilted his head. "Looks like something out of a pawn bin." The man's smile was faint, but cut like a blade honed too long. "That's because you don't recognize it. Should I?" The man lifted his hand slightly, just enough to let the light run along the band's edge. He rotated his wrist once, slowly, then let it settle again. The motion was measured, deliberate, like someone recalling an old pattern of behavior. "It's not a ring," he said. "It's a marker." Grady took a breath. "Military?" The man's voice dropped half an octave. "Worse." Grady waited. The old man didn't blink. "It's a wartime code," he said, "for people who worked behind walls, between departments. Black sites, counter-intel." Grady frowned. 701 isn't a military code. It doesn't match anything. "That's the point," the man said. "It's not for the record. It's for those who were never supposed to be named." Grady's throat tightened. Something about the number scratched at his memory. He didn't want to ask, but the question clawed its way out. "What does it stand for?" The man looked directly at him now. "It's the designation used in internal documents during the 2006 probe. The one they buried. The one you helped bury." Grady froze. His hand dropped slowly to his side. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He could see it now, clear as day. A page scanned into a digital file, time-stamped, marked, classified. A phrase he hadn't thought about in over a decade. 701. Not unauthorized access investigation, T3. A ghost document, not formally filed, not officially assigned, but real. "I was there," the old man said. "I watched you fold. I watched you turn your head while someone else took the blame. Then you signed the logbook and walked out like it was nothing." Grady's voice came out hoarse. "You're making assumptions." "No," the man said. "You're pretending I forgot." Grady stepped back just slightly. His eyes dropped to the ring again. His pulse jumped when the man raised his hand and tapped the metal band once against the edge of the steel bench. The sound was soft, hollow, but it echoed louder than it should have. "You thought time would wash it away," the man continued. "You thought silence was protection. It wasn't." Grady clenched his jaw. "You don't get to come in here and play ghost." "I'm not playing," the old man replied. "You were the one pretending to forget how deep the stain runs." Another tap of the ring against the bench. Not a threat, a reminder. Grady turned, one hand gripping the edge of the doorframe, the other curling into a fist. Behind him, the man's voice reached out, calm, even, merciless. Only traitors forget the codes that made them. Grady didn't look back, but he heard it, felt it, and for the first time in a very long time, he didn't know what came next. Grady's boots struck the linoleum with hard, clipped impact, a rhythm of rising tension as he stalked down the corridor outside the holding cells. The silence that hung between flickering fluorescent lights felt unnatural now, no longer institutional, but watchful, as if the building itself had taken a breath and decided to wait. Behind him, 2 junior officers trailed with uncertain steps, stealing glances at the man sitting inside the reinforced cell. The old man hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, hadn't spoken since they brought him in. He just sat there, eyes lowered, hands folded neatly in front of him like a monk awaiting a storm. Grady had seen every flavor of defiance in a suspect: rage, fear, silence born of stubbornness or stupidity. But this wasn't any of that. This wasn't silence. This was stillness, studied, measured, deliberate. It itched beneath Grady's skin like a memory he couldn't place. He stopped, exhaled, and tapped his access badge against the door's control panel. The light blinked red. Again, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Another tap, another red blink. A low mechanical tone sounded. Denial, sharp and final. The system wasn't just frozen, it had rejected him. "It's locked," said one of the officers. Grady turned slowly, voice edged like honed steel. "No shit! Who locked it?" The younger officer hesitated, looked at the control panel, and then back at Grady. "No one. The log shows no manual override. It locked itself." Something about those words sliced into Grady's spine like cold wire. He looked back at the old man, still seated, still quiet, still disturbingly calm. Grady pressed his palm against the glass. "We're moving him. Now. Override it." The officer stepped forward, typed rapidly into the wall mount console, fingers skipping over the digital key. A low click echoed. The screen read, "Access denied, security protocol initiated." "Override failed," the officer said, voice dry with disbelief. "The system triggered automatic lockdown on this cell." It was then that the old man stood. He did it slowly, but not because of age or weariness, because he wanted every second to land like a footstep in wet cement. His spine unfolded with the precision of someone trained not just to move, but to control space. The sleeves of his coat settled at his wrists. He rotated one shoulder, then the other, like a fighter preparing to step back into a ring he'd already won once before. Grady watched, fists clenched. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. "What did you do?" The old man tilted his head, not in confusion, but judgment. Then he spoke, and his voice came steady, deep, touched with a clarity that froze the air. "The safety protocol," he said, "is automatically activated when an invalid retrieval attempt is made more than 3 times on a restricted profile." He turned his eyes directly to Grady, and it was like being hit with the full weight of a memory you didn't know you had. "You tried 3 times? You failed 3 times. The system doesn't ask why." Grady stepped back involuntarily, a flicker of alarm breaking across his mask of arrogance. "Bullshit. You expect me to believe you triggered this?" The man's mouth twitched at the corner, not a smile, but a warning dressed as indifference. "I didn't trigger anything," he said. "You did. I just knew you would." The younger officer stammered. "Is this some kind of hack? External override? Who gave him system-level access?" Grady spun around. "Shut up." He turned back to the cell, jaw tight. "Who the hell are you, really?" The old man walked slowly to the glass, until only inches separated them. His presence, even through reinforced polymer, was undeniable, a kind of gravity that bent the air. "You'll know," he said, and the words came out not as a threat, not as a promise, but as an execution sentence already signed. "In 30 minutes. Grady paced now, short bursts of frustration snapping at his heels. The walls seemed to lean closer with every step, each sterile tile reflecting back the truth he didn't want to face. He wasn't in control anymore. The old man had introduced a different current to the air, one that didn't hum with bureaucracy or badge-backed power, but something older, deeper, harder to silence. The junior officer spoke again, quieter this time, as if raising his voice might set off another invisible alarm. "We ran the scan twice. Biometrics, facial, voice. Nothing matches any federal or international registry." Grady gritted his teeth. "I don't care what it says. He's a civilian. Civilians don't get root-level security clearance. Civilians don't shut down doors. Civilians don't sit there with the confidence of someone who's been through this building 100 times before," the officer interrupted, too anxious to catch himself. Grady's eyes slashed toward him like a blade. The officer backed off immediately. Silence returned, heavy and full of unsaid things. Behind the glass, the old man sat again with the same regal ease, as if the cold steel bench was a throne he'd chosen, not been assigned. He didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't move. Yet his stillness radiated a pressure more oppressive than shouting. He was the eye of the storm, and everything around him knew it. Grady tapped furiously into his tablet. Command lines scrolled. Denied, blocked, restricted. The system had rerouted itself. There was no trace of tampering, no signs of infiltration. This wasn't a cyber attack, it was architecture. This lockout had been pre-written, embedded in layers of protocol far beyond Grady's clearance. The cell was sealed not as punishment but as procedure, as if the building itself had instructions for this exact moment, as if it had always expected this man to return. "How long has he been off the record?" Grady muttered aloud, more to the blinking cursor than to the officers behind him. "Long enough to become a ghost," the younger one replied, almost reverently. "And ghosts don't break in. They wait until someone opens the door." Grady spun toward the console again, fingers trembling now with more than anger. Reset permissions. Backdoor sequence. Full admin sweep. The system didn't reject him this time. It ignored him. Nothing changed. Nothing acknowledged. It was as if Grady's access no longer mattered. Across the cell, the old man's voice floated again, like smoke trailing from the edges of a long dormant fire. "You keep trying to win a game you never understood the rules of." He didn't raise his voice, but the words landed like hammers inside Grady's chest. "And every time you reach for control, you prove why it was never yours to begin with." "Who gave you access?" Grady barked. "What network are you hooked into? Who's running this? NSA, CIA, what the hell is this?" The old man didn't flinch. "Not everything needs to be hacked when you've once been invited in. You see walls, I see doors I built myself, and what you call a prison, I call a checkpoint." There was no bluff in his tone, no strain, just fact, cold, polished, and immovable. The kind of authority that wasn't worn like a badge, but engraved deep, like a scar, earned. Grady stepped forward, pressing both palms to the reinforced glass, like he could press through to a truth just out of reach. The old man met his eyes. "You said 30 minutes, Grady murmured. "Less a demand and more a concession. What happens in 30 minutes? The old man looked at the digital clock on the wall. It blinked steadily. 13:34. "That's not the right question," he said. "The right question is, who will you be when they arrive?" "They?" Grady repeated, but the word tasted wrong, heavy with implication. "They," the old man confirmed, and for the first time something like pity slid across his expression. "You built this cage thinking you'd keep others in it. You forgot that one day it might be sealed from the outside, with you inside." He stood again, slower this time, the gravity of the moment pulling at every movement. Not dramatic, inevitable. He walked to the edge of the bench, placed one hand on the wall and leaned in. His breath fogged a faint circle on the bulletproof divider. 30 minutes, officer. That's how long it takes for a system to erase its mistakes." He stepped back into the center of the room, let his arms fall loosely at his sides, and tilted his head up toward the overhead camera lens that still blinked red, recording nothing, watching everything. Outside, Grady took a step back. For the first time since the man had spoken in court, he felt small, not just outmaneuvered, outsized. He wasn't a man defending the law anymore. He was standing in its shadow, and behind that glass, the shadow had a name. He just didn't know it yet. The silence hadn't left, it had only changed shapes. What had once pressed like an invisible fog through the corridor outside the holding cell now condensed into something colder, sharper, confined within the steel edges of Interrogation Room C. Grady sat across from the old man, his jaw locked, fists clenched on the table's edge. The room was small, boxy, lit by a single overhead light that did nothing to warm its sterile gray. The walls, once familiar, now pulsed with an invisible tension he couldn't explain, like a breath held in digital lungs. The machine in the corner blinked a steady green. The interrogation recorder. Motion activated, time-stamped verified, voice activated and integrated directly into the precinct's digital archive. It had never failed before. Grady had trusted it more than the people who operated it. Now, as he leaned forward, speaking the first words of the session, something changed. There was no beep. No red indicator, no response. The screen displayed recording in progress, but the digital feed remained blank. No waveforms, no data, nothing. He glanced at the tech monitor embedded on the wall. "System error?" he barked. The junior technician watching from the observation bay tapped the console again, a puzzled look growing in his eyes. No, sir, it says it's recording, just not capturing anything. Run a check. I want diagnostics now, Grady snapped. The old man didn't move. He sat across the metal table with his fingers interlocked, eyes steady, chin slightly lifted, not defiant, not passive, present, fully, completely. He studied Grady with a kind of clinical detachment, like a professor waiting for his student to realize he's been reading the wrong book. You know what this is? The old man asked, voice calm, clear, unmoved. He tapped a finger slowly on the steel tabletop. This isn't malfunction. It's a signal, a very precise one. Grady's lip curled. What are you saying? You rigged the recorder? What kind of backdoor crap are you pulling now? No back doors, the man said. Just protocols. That red icon on the screen? He pointed behind Grady. That's not a glitch. That's a temporary encryption flag. NSA standard. F731 series. It only triggers during classified escalation, and only when the system detects overlapping security jurisdictions. Which means, he said, tapping once more with a deliberate finality, someone above both of us is listening, and someone above them decided this conversation won't be recorded. Grady turned sharply. The icon was there. Small, glowing red, centered in the top right corner of the status display. He'd seen it once before, in a training seminar years ago. It was theoretical, a fail-safe for top-tier federal overlaps, classified channels, reserved for internal containment, where surveillance itself became a liability. Bullshit, he muttered, rising from his seat. You're making this up. If I were, the old man replied evenly, you wouldn't still be sitting in a room that thinks it's recording while logging nothing. Your machine isn't broken, officer. It's being told not to remember. Grady slammed the table, the sharp metal-on-metal thud echoing like a gunshot. Why the hell would they do that? Who are you to trigger that kind of lockdown? He pointed accusingly across the table. You don't even have a goddamn name in our system. And that, the man said, leaning forward now, his voice lower, colder, deliberate, is exactly why I'm dangerous. The system can't forget me, because it was built by people like me. But it will hide me when necessary. It will erase what it can't afford to explain. And right now, it decided you don't get to keep a copy of this conversation. There was no bravado in his tone, no arrogance. Just control, hard, quiet control, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself anymore. Grady turned to the mirror behind them, where the tech team sat paralyzed. Cut the room. Pull the logs. I want a fresh unit brought in now. Audio, video, whatever the hell works. The door didn't open. No movement. The lights didn't flicker. But the system didn't respond either. No command acknowledgement. Just stillness. Absolute, impenetrable. The old man rested his elbows lightly on the table, voice steady as stone. You think you're conducting an interrogation, Officer Grady. You're not. You're attending a briefing, and it's already over. Grady's laugh was short, brittle. Is that right? So what now? You expect me to believe this whole thing's a setup? That you waltz in here, flip a few switches in your ghost file, and the federal government decides to scrub the room clean just because you say the word? The man stared at him, and something in his gaze stopped the room from breathing. No, he said, not because I say the word, because they already know the sentence. Grady's fury was visible now. The muscles in his neck corded. His fists flexed open and shut like pistons misfiring. He stepped closer, leaned across the table until their faces were only a breath apart. You think you're the only one who knows how the system works? I've spent my life enforcing it. I've put people like you away before. The old man didn't blink. And how many of them were guilty? Grady opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The silence lasted too long. The old man continued, his tone shifting, not softer but sharper, like glass catching the light just before it cuts. That's the problem with men like you. You think enforcement is justice. You think silence is guilt. You think the system's flaws are cracks to be filled with threats and paperwork. But some records are blank for a reason. Some names are never meant to be printed, and some truths are heavier than you know how to carry. Grady slammed the recorder off the desk, sending it skidding to the corner. Sparks flared briefly before dying. The old man didn't flinch. "I'll file this myself," Grady growled. "I'll write every word of this down and burn it into the logbooks if I have to." "You can try," the man said, folding his hands again. "But they won't keep your version. They never do." Grady's face twisted. "You smug bastard." The man leaned back in his chair and said the final words with a calmness that ended the room. "Time's up for the performance officer. Now we begin the reckoning." The table between them sat like a border wall, cold, silent, oppressive, and yet it was the only thing in the room that hadn't betrayed its function. Grady's chest heaved. His breathing had turned shallow, not from exhaustion, but from something worse, uncertainty. It was the first time in years he wasn't sure if he was still the one in control. The old man adjusted the cuff of his sleeve with care, like a man who'd done it 1,000 times in front of high-level intelligence panels, not police officers. "You think this is about you?" he asked, not mocking, just precise, clipped. "You were just the one arrogant enough to grab the wrong thread. Now the entire weave is coming undone. That red icon up there?" He nodded toward the screen. "It's a broadcast filter. The moment it activated, your building was reclassified. Your precinct is now a federal silent zone." Grady blinked, but said nothing. The magnitude of what he was hearing settled like iron filings in his gut. He wanted to laugh, but couldn't find the edge of it. He wanted to scream, but no one left to hear would understand why. "You're bluffing," he said finally, but his voice cracked at the edges. The man gave him nothing. "This isn't a bluff, Grady. This is a burial. Of noise, of mistakes. Of men who thought procedure gave them power. The government doesn't fix everything, but it cleans what it can't admit." The tech room light flickered once behind the glass, then again, then went out entirely. Grady turned toward the mirror, but it reflected only him now. Not the others, not the gear, just his own shape in silhouette. "You're shutting this whole place down?" he muttered, stunned. The old man didn't nod. He didn't need to. His presence was confirmation enough. "This conversation," he said, his voice almost gentle now, "will never be logged. It will not exist in your reports. It won't be part of your record, because this isn't about justice anymore. This is about containment." Grady swallowed hard. The room suddenly felt 5 degrees colder. His hand hovered near his holster, not in threat but in reflex, a useless grasp for control. "You're going to disappear," he said, unsure now if it was a threat or a question. The man smiled, faint and tired, as if he'd been waiting for someone to finally ask the right wrong question. "I never reappeared to begin with." The overhead monitor blinked once more. The red icon dissolved. The screen went black. No beep, no shutdown chime, just off. Final. Grady looked back at the man sitting before him. Every protocol, every trick, every thread of the system he believed he could manipulate had been torn clean. There was nothing left to press, no ladder to climb. He wasn't speaking to a suspect anymore. He was speaking to a relic, one that still had the authority to make the walls forget what they'd just seen. And the worst part was, knowing the walls would obey. He took a breath, but it sounded hollow. "What do you want from me?" The man stood slowly. "Nothing," he said. "That's what makes it harder. I came here to see how far you'd fall on your own." Grady's voice was small now, hoarse. "Why me?" The man stepped to the door, paused, then said without turning, "Because someone like you always believes they're the apex predator until the silence eats them whole." And with that, the door opened, not with a beep, not with a click, but like a wound, soundless and irreversible. The door sealed shut behind the old man, with a sound so soft it might have been imagined, and yet, to Grady, it felt like the final punctuation to a sentence he hadn't realized was already written. He stood alone in the now vacant interrogation room, the air still charged with something electrical and ancient, as if the room had retained the residue of what had just passed, a conversation not logged, a presence not erased. Then, from above, The digital wall monitor clicked. A timer blinked into life in stark white numbers against a black background. 27 o'clock. It didn't count down. It held, frozen, ticking and waiting. Grady stepped forward, watching the numbers as if willing them to explain themselves, but they remained as mute and unyielding as the man who had just walked out. He turned on his heel, storming into the hallway, and stopped. Empty. No technicians at their consoles. No guards at the security checkpoints. Every door he passed stood open, wide like jaws, their motionless hinges whispering of abandonment. The usual buzz of controlled chaos, the distant radios, footsteps, quiet chatter, was gone. The hum of fluorescent lights had never sounded so loud, so absolute. Grady walked faster now, eyes darting toward each vacant station. Security room 2, empty. Surveillance hub, doors ajar. Monitors black. Requisition desk abandoned. Hello? His voice rang out, hollow and unanswered, lost in a corridor that no longer responded to him. He reached for his radio. Static. He flipped through the channels. Nothing. Not even interference. Not even dead air. Just absence. He rushed toward central control, the glass walls still fogged with heat from recently departed bodies, chairs still pushed slightly askew. The primary security console blinked at him, cursor frozen, the system stuck on one word: suspended. A thin vein of sweat traced down his temple. Then he heard it, the unmistakable clack of reinforced shoes on tile. He spun, but no one was there. Back in the holding area, the man, still unnamed, still unreadable, stood in his cell, hand placed gently over his chest. He tilted his head toward the ceiling as if listening to something only he could hear. Then he spoke. Not loudly, but with a force that passed through the walls like a current. "There was a time," he said, "when I stood exactly where you stand now, certain, armed. Convinced the system was mine to wield. I believed I was the end point of consequence, until I chose to stop. You," he said, pausing to let the word land, "still believe you are the center." Grady reappeared at the hallway junction, hands clenched into fists. "What is this? What the hell is this?" he shouted, not toward the man, but toward everything. The cameras that didn't respond, the doors that no longer obeyed, the lights that blinked with disinterest. "Mayday!" he screamed into the void. No answer. He turned toward the holding cell, face flushed with heat. "Who are you?" he roared. The old man finally moved, just a step forward, just enough to bring his face into full view behind the reinforced glass. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I am," he said, "the last person you should have touched without knowing who you were touching." The lights flickered once. The timer blinked again. 27 o'clock still. Grady staggered back a half step, caught between fury and disbelief. Every inch of the precinct, once his to command, now felt foreign, alien even. The blinking cursor on the terminal wasn't just a system message, it was a taunt. Everything that had always yielded to his rank, his clearance, his voice, none of it answered now. He was screaming into a room that had already decided it no longer heard him. He moved with urgency now, not toward the exit, but deeper into the maze of corridors, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could verify this wasn't some twisted simulation. But every hallway turned up empty. The armory was sealed. The evidence locker stood open with its lights off. Even the cafeteria, usually humming with off-shift chatter and cheap coffee, was a dead zone. Back at the holding cell, the old man remained motionless, his hand still resting lightly over his chest. He wasn't watching the clock. He didn't need to. He was listening for the moment, the subtle tick of inevitability. When Grady finally returned, breathing harder now, tie loose, shirt clinging to his back, his eyes met the old man's again, and this time there was no pretense left, just raw, exposed confusion. "What is happening?" he asked. Not demanded, not challenged, but asked. And in that shift, something cracked. "You've spent your career building cages," the man said, still with that unshakable calm. "Rooms designed to hold people you thought you understood. But what you never learned, what none of you ever learn, is that the architecture of control always turns inward. Eventually, the builder finds himself inside his own design. Grady shook his head. This doesn't make sense. There are fail-safes, there are systems, all of which were written, the man interrupted, by men. And men, he added, can be overridden, especially when they've forgotten their place in the sequence. The lights above them pulsed slightly, not flickering this time, but dimming, like lungs deflating. Grady stared up, then back at the clock, still frozen at 27:00 clock, like a held breath, waiting to collapse into movement. The weight of that number was becoming unbearable. Why 27? Why not 30? Why hold? Tell me what happens when it moves, Grady said, his voice quieter now. The old man smiled, but it wasn't a grin. It was a knowing, sharp and cold. That depends entirely on you. The question isn't what the clock does, it's what you'll become when it starts again. Grady looked around once more. Not a sound, not a motion. Only the ticking absence of a system in stasis. There's no one left, he said. No, the old man agreed. They were never here for you. Then, for the first time, the old man moved to the center of the cell and did something Grady didn't expect. He closed his eyes, both hands placed now over his heart, head slightly tilted back, a posture of surrender or prayer, but neither word fit. It wasn't religious, it was ritual, familiar, practiced, and somehow it terrified Grady more than anything the man had said. "What are you doing?" Grady asked, but he already knew the question was irrelevant. He stepped toward the cell, as close as the barrier allowed, and pressed his palm against the glass, willing it to yield, to say something, to respond like it used to. It didn't. And then, almost imperceptibly, the monitor blinked. 26:59, it had started. The number shifted silently, the way a fault line begins to give way beneath thousands of tons of denial. 26:58, 26:57, Grady didn't move. The idea that a countdown had begun, and that he had no idea what would happen when it reached zero, settled over him like a shroud. His instincts told him to act, to command, to issue orders that would restore the world to its proper configuration. But there was no one left to command. The world, it seemed, had configured itself without him. He turned to the console again. One last desperate attempt to reconnect. The keyboard registered his inputs, but the system no longer responded with error codes or denials. It didn't respond at all. The interface was dead, but aware, like an eye refusing to blink. In the cell, the old man opened his eyes and spoke again, his voice clearer than ever, as if each tick of the clock carried it further into the marrow of the building. "You don't understand time, Grady. You think it's something you use. Schedule, enforce, survive, but time uses you. It breaks you down in slow, measured intervals until all that's left is what you tried to hide beneath your badge." Grady banged a fist against the control panel. "I didn't ask for this." "No," the man agreed. "You just opened the door." Grady turned back, his face ashen, the weight of the moment visibly anchoring his limbs. He was no longer fighting, he was waiting, and he didn't even know what for. Every inch of the station had been neutralized. Every protocol he trusted now felt like decoration. The man stepped closer to the glass now, and the two locked eyes with nothing but a thin sheet of reinforced polymer between them. "Tell me, officer," the man said, his tone quiet, intimate, surgical. "When you cuffed the wrong man in front of a courtroom, what did you think you were doing? Protecting the system or preserving your pride?" Grady didn't answer, couldn't. The truth had stopped accepting bribes. The countdown continued, 26:40, 26:39. Then came a sound, not loud but undeniable. Somewhere deeper in the station, a mechanical door opened, not the kind opened by badge access or palm scan, but one heavier, magnetic, industrial. Grady flinched. The sound meant movement, and movement meant he was no longer alone. He rushed to the security hub, but the feeds remained dark. He slammed a key, forcing a reboot. A few monitors flashed back to life, grainy and incomplete, but just enough to reveal the elevators in motion. Multiple levels, simultaneous descent. They were coming. He didn't know who, he didn't know why, but the old man had never spoken of maybes, only inevitabilities. Back in the cell, the man returned to his seat as if nothing had changed, but everything had. He'd spoken no threat, he'd issued no demand, but he had dismantled Grady's reality with surgical calm, and now, whatever waited at the bottom of those elevator shafts had been summoned not by force, but by schedule. Grady stood in the corridor, frozen between instinct and impotence, between the man in the cage and the shadows rising toward him. He looked one last time at the blinking screen, 26:01, and in that single minute, for the first time in his life, Grady realized he wasn't part of the operation, he was the subject of it. The clock hit 26:00, then moved with eerie smoothness, counting backward toward something that had no defined name. Grady stood in a shadowed corner of the security corridor, jaw clenched, unable to look away from the digital countdown. He knew, even before it reached 0, that whatever waited on the other side wasn't just protocol, it wasn't backup, it wasn't help, it was judgment. When the monitor reached 30-0, it didn't beep, it didn't flash, it didn't even change color. It simply arrived. Outside, in the silence that blanketed the precinct, 6 black SUVs turned the corner of the block as one. Their engines made no sound, no sirens, no lights, no urgency, only precision. They glided to a stop in front of the precinct's main entrance, and for a moment they just sat there, humming quietly, as if testing the air before entering. Then the doors opened. 12 figures emerged, tall, deliberate, clad in tactical suits that bore no agency insignias except for one, a subdued embossed patch pressed into their shoulders like a ghost brand, OB7. The patch shimmered faintly beneath the street lamps, not reflecting light, but eating it. Their boots hit pavement in perfect sync, not marching, not running, delivering. A quiet announcement of force that didn't need to raise its voice. Inside, Grady stood frozen. He heard the front doors open. Not violently, not rushed, just open. The air pressure in the building shifted as the men entered. Lights flickered again. Hallway sensors activated automatically. Motion stimulated. But there was no chatter on the radios, no ping on the internal system. The men moved without permission. They didn't need access. They were the override. From inside his cell, the old man exhaled, slowly, then stood. It was not a hurried movement. There was no defiance, no resistance. It was the rising of something inevitable. He reached to the cuffs of his sleeves and adjusted them with care, rolling them once, then twice, until they sat just right above the wrist. The gesture wasn't habit, it was heritage. Then he straightened the seam of his coat, brushed invisible dust from his lapel, and turned toward the cell door. Grady stepped out into the main corridor just as the lead agent passed through the inner security gate. Their eyes met for the briefest second. The agent said nothing, didn't slow, didn't nod. He just walked past. Behind him, the others followed like a black tide that didn't break or hesitate. They moved as one, past offices, past the badge scanner, past the place where Grady's name had once meant authority. Now it meant nothing. The lead agent reached the cell. He tapped a small device to the locking panel. It didn't scan, it didn't beep. The door just clicked and opened. The old man didn't move at first. He stood with dignity carved into every line of his frame, then lifted his chin, and for the first time in hours he spoke. Not to the agents, but to Grady, who stood rigid near the end of the hallway, mouth slightly open, hand twitching near the grip of his weapon. "I told you," the man said, voice calm, clear, and cruel in its precision, "you should never arrest someone before you ask their name." Grady didn't move. His hand hovered near the butt of his sidearm, but he didn't draw. He couldn't, not because of hesitation, but because something deeper had locked him in place. It wasn't fear, it was recognition, that singular, suffocating realization that the man he thought was just another anomaly was something far more consequential, the kind of person who didn't need to speak loud to make walls crumble, the kind of person who never entered a room, they were the room. The agents didn't look at Grady. Not one of them. Their silence was louder than any accusation, more final than any sentence. They formed a loose column behind the old man, not flanking him, not guarding him, accompanying him, escorting a sovereign. The corridor stretched long and narrow as the old man stepped through the threshold of the open cell. Each step was quiet, deliberate, monumental. Grady took half a step forward, finally finding his voice, cracked and low. "Wait. Who gave the order?" The lead agent didn't stop walking, but as he passed, he said 6 words that shattered Grady's illusion of relevance. "You don't have the clearance to know." It was more than a rebuke. It was a funeral bell for Grady's authority. The old man passed Grady now, close enough for the officer to feel the chill radiating from a presence so thoroughly removed from protocol that no handbook could define it. He didn't even glance sideways, just walked with the kind of grace that comes from living beyond consequence. Behind them, the other agents moved in perfect formation, their faces unreadable beneath matte black helmets and visors. None of them touched the walls, none brushed the door frames. Their boots made no unnecessary sound. They weren't here to collect, they were here to reclaim. Grady's eyes darted to the monitors, each now showing static. Even the internal logs, he knew, would yield nothing. This moment was already being erased. He turned back, voice rising now with panic cloaked in defiance. "This is my precinct. You can't just—" But his words collapsed under the weight of the man's silence. The old man paused at the exit, turned his head ever so slightly, not to respond, but to mark the end. "This," he said, not with anger, but with absolute finality, "was never yours." Then he stepped outside. The air outside was impossibly still. The SUVs waited, doors still open, as if time itself had parked to receive him. The agents took their places around him. No words were exchanged. The moment required none. The man entered the vehicle and it sealed like a vault. A second later, the convoy pulled away in perfect unison. No lights, no sirens, just vanishing. Inside the building, Grady remained frozen. His sidearm hung limp at his hip, his spine locked, his mouth dry. The badge on his chest felt suddenly heavy, less like metal, more like an anchor. The lights above stopped flickering. The screen in the hallway turned black. The security feed reset. Everything removed to normal, except Grady. He hadn't been removed. He had been overridden. The hallway echoed in a way Grady had never heard before, not with sound, but with vacancy. The usual weight of institutional authority, the rules, the codes, the structure, was gone. In its place lingered something more primal, the crushing awareness that he no longer mattered. He wasn't a cog in the machine. He was the leftover bolt from an old model, left rolling on the floor after the upgrade. He walked slowly back to the central hub, hands hanging uselessly by his sides, monitors rebooted one by one, screens returning to idle menus, badge scanners blinking green again, as if inviting new input, as if nothing had happened. But Grady couldn't bring himself to touch them. They no longer recognized him, or perhaps it had never truly done so. It was only now that the illusion had lifted. His footsteps led him to the observation bay, the one facing the interrogation room. From behind the glass, he looked at the bench where the old man had sat. It was empty, unassuming, yet there was still a pressure in the air around it, like the walls were holding their breath. The glass didn't show a reflection anymore. It only showed absence. He remembered the old man's words, about names, about cages, about time. He looked down at his badge, fingers brushing its worn surface. How many people had he arrested in the name of procedure? How many had he processed, questioned, filed, never once asking the only question that mattered? Who are you really? He took the badge off again, this time not out of defeat, but out of understanding. Downstairs in the admin bay, systems began rebooting, but they didn't bring Grady back in. He watched from the upper floor as staff returned one by one, unaware, resumes in hand, questions in their eyes. The chain of command would pretend nothing had happened. The files would be blank, the footage erased, the agents would never be named. The old man? He'd already become silence again. Yet Grady knew, and that knowing was heavier than any report. At 31:08, the internal clocks reset. Everything went back to baseline, everything but him. He turned away from the window, walked past the badge scanner without showing ID, and left the precinct through the same front door the SUVs had rolled in through. Outside, the sky was gold and violet, the city oblivious. He didn't look back. The badge stayed behind. But for the first time, Grady knew who was really watching, and they hadn't left. They never do. Grady hadn't made it far down the hall when the temperature of the air changed again. It wasn't a drop in degrees, but something deeper, a shift in atmosphere, as though the walls had realized they weren't the highest authority in the building anymore. He froze. Instinct ticking. Then he heard it. Bootsteps. Healed. Measured. Intentional. Not the kind that rushed. The kind that arrived. From the south corridor, a woman emerged. She didn't wear a local badge, didn't carry a weapon visible to the eye, but every movement screamed jurisdiction. Her suit was black, darker than regulation, cut with precision, military in frame, federal in essence. No insignia, no introductions. She moved through the precinct like it belonged to her. And maybe in some buried file it did. The agents flanking the corridor stiffened. No one stopped her, not even the building. She stepped directly in front of the reinforced cell. Her gaze locked with the man inside. Her face was unreadable, cold, but not hostile. And then, with the smallest tilt of her chin, she spoke. "Hello, 01. The name dropped like a detonation in the dead center of the room. Not loud, but devastating. The silence that followed was volcanic. The air stalled. The fluorescence above seemed to flicker once, unsure how to react. Conversations died mid-syllable. Fingers hovered above keys. Phones stopped ringing. Not a breath was taken that wasn't shaken. Grady turned sharply, mouth half open. "That's not, He disappeared. The old man turned his head and looked straight at him. "I never left," he said. Calm, clear, absolute. "I just chose to stand behind the mirror and watch what became of you all. When you forgot where you came from." Grady staggered back half a step, not from force, from the clarity in that voice, from the realization that he had stood, shouted, cuffed, and questioned in front of something no one had warned him about, because no one dared speak it. The woman stepped forward. From her inner jacket she pulled a badge. Matte black, no name, no number. Only 3 concentric circles and a single sigil, Omega 1. She held it up. By federal order and Omega-level clearance, the witness designated 01 is under sovereign exemption protocol and immediate transport. Sovereign exemption? Grady's voice was almost laughable in comparison. He's a suspect in court. The woman turned slightly. "Not anymore. He's the record." Behind her, agents filed into position. Silent, composed, wearing gear that didn't reflect light. Absorbed it. Their presence was not intimidation, it was inevitability. Grady tried again. "You can't just walk in here." She cut him off with a glance. "We didn't walk in. We resumed custody." The cell door opened. No click, no code, no fingerprint. Just opened, as if it had never truly been locked. 09 stepped forward, slowly. Every motion deliberate, dignified. His fingers adjusted the edge of his sleeve, not for comfort, for symbolism. He passed the threshold, and for the first time since stepping foot in that building, he did so on his own terms. Grady took one small, defiant step forward. "What is this? What was this whole game?" The woman faced him. "This wasn't a game. This was a test." Test for what? To see if the system still remembers who created it. 09 moved to the center of the corridor. He faced Grady, not with anger, but with clarity. "You said in that courtroom, I don't care who he is. Get him out." Grady's face went pale. "You shoulda cared," the old man said. He stepped past him without another glance. The woman turned back to Grady one last time. "You weren't supposed to see this, but now that you have, remember this. Not every name forgotten is gone. Some are hidden to protect you." Grady opened his mouth, but no words came. The agents moved in formation, not to surround 01, but to accompany him, the way dignitaries are flanked, not suspects. There were no chains, no orders barked. Just a quiet reverence, the kind reserved for weapons too precise to be drawn, too important to be displayed. They disappeared down the corridor. Grady stayed behind. He walked slowly to the monitor bay, eyes scanning for any footage of what had just happened. The screens were black. When he tried to refresh the feed, an error code appeared. Omega, access revoked. Event purged. Behind him, the junior officer approached. "Sir, do you want me to log an incident report?" Grady stared straight ahead. "There's nothing to report." But forget it happened. He walked out. Back in the interrogation room, the chair was empty, but it still carried weight. And on the bench outside Grady's office, a single item remained. His badge. Not thrown, not lost, placed, like a man who finally understood. There are names not to be spoken, questions not to be asked, and systems that don't answer to authority, only to memory. And memory had just walked out of the building. The hum of the engine was soft. Too soft for vehicles armored to this level. The convoy moved through the federal corridor like a black vein through the body of a sleeping city, silent and direct. Inside the middle SUV, nothing moved except the slight sway of the suspension and the flickering reflection of passing lights on matte windows. It wasn't a transport vehicle, it was a chamber, not built to confine, built to contain. 01 sat calmly, hands resting lightly on his knees, eyes forward but not fixed on anything specific. Opposite him, the female agent who had spoken his name sat rigid, her tablet locked between gloved fingers. Between them, a small black box rested on the seat. It bore no logo, no label, just 3 subtle lines etched into the surface, like old battle scars no one ever buffed out. She tapped the box once. It unlocked with a soft hiss, not digital, not mechanical, something older. The lid rose. Inside was a photograph, worn edges, printed on fiber paper. Not copied, original, the kind no scanner dares digitize. In it, Grady, younger, leaner, angrier. His hand gripped the collar of a young black suspect, forcing him down over a table. Face turned away from the lens, the moment frozen mid-interrogation. The suspect's fingers bloodied from restraint straps, his neck straining under pressure. Behind them, a one-way mirror, cracked on the edge. Below the photo, handwritten in precise block letters, Charleston, 2006, investigation forcibly terminated. 01 didn't flinch. He reached in, lifted the photo with the same care one might lift a relic from a crime scene. He stared at it, long and still. The weight in the silence was palpable. "We've been watching him since that moment," the agent said. Her voice didn't ask for approval. "He was one of ours. Bright, sharp, and he went dark that day." "He didn't go dark," 00 replied without looking up. He was told to close his eyes. The agent beside her leaned in. "You think he remembers it the same way you do?" "I think he remembers the version he was told to survive," 001 said. "I remember the truth he left behind." The agent glanced at the tablet again. A different image displayed. A scan of the same interrogation room from above, time-stamped, with a red circle highlighting the suspect's face. Enlarged, the image revealed a bruise below the jawline, not visible from Grady's angle, but perfectly framed for a viewer behind the glass. "That boy didn't survive that year," 001 said. No one argued. She pulled out a second item, a memo, thicker paper, old. A field report marked, "Don't pursue." Unit reassigned, flagged for admin review. The signature on the bottom was faint, almost erased. 00's own. "I buried it," he said, "not to protect the system, but to see what it would do when left unchecked." The agent across nodded. 16 years, no intervention, just surveillance. "And today?" she asked quietly. 01 lifted his eyes. Today. He stopped being watched. The woman didn't hesitate. "We've had contingencies in place, files ready to seal, surveillance rerouted. If you gave the signal..." 0M nodded once. "That's the signal?" She tapped her earpiece twice. Across encrypted lines, silent orders began to execute. Systems across federal nodes quietly corrected themselves. Access logs vanished. Grady's arrest record was rewritten as administrative error. Internal reports were flagged for Omega oversight. Every digital trace tied to that courtroom disappeared, file by file. Back in the precincts, screens blinked. Terminals timed out, doors rekeyed. Grady's access codes were disabled one by one. Not violently, not visibly, just gone. Inside the SUV, the woman removed a sealed folder from a lockbox under the seat. She laid it in front of 01. The seal on it, Omega classified, eyes only, 01 authorized. He opened it without ceremony. Inside were 2 decades of surveillance. Photos, logs, memos, training evaluations, psychological profiles. Grady mapped year by year. A line in red ink, highly effective, operates under stress, prone to moral rationalization. Another, suppressed empathy responses noted, suggest longer-term observation. He flipped past them all until he reached a thin paper, cracked, faded, an old complaint, handwritten, filed one day after Charleston, signed by a man no longer alive, his brother. He stared at it for a long time. The agent across asked, "Do you want to confront him?" "No," 01 replied. "You don't want him to answer for it?" "He already did. He just didn't know it was the test." She asked, "So what happens next?" He closed the file. We remember. The SUV slowed as it neared the compound. High walls, no markings, the kind of place you don't stumble upon. You're brought to it. Inside, every inch of air had purpose. It didn't echo, it absorbed. They pulled into a subterranean level. The vehicle stopped with a quiet hiss. The door opened. 01 stepped out with the black box in his hands. The agents followed, and the machine remembered what it had built. The metallic door sealed behind him with a finality that wasn't loud, but definitive, like a page turning that would never be reopened. Grady sat in the center of the observation room, a sterile, square space that bore no insignia, no sense of jurisdiction, only the chill of waiting judgment. The light overhead was deliberate, cool, unwavering, engineered not to blind but to strip away shadows. There were no restraints, no cuffs, no armed guards, just the silence and the screen. It flickered to life. No sound, only image. Grady leaned forward instinctively, unsure if he was meant to react or remain composed. The frame opened on a room he recognized immediately. Charleston, 2006. The interrogation suite had been updated since then, but not by much. He saw himself, leaner, louder, jaw locked, sleeves rolled, knuckles white from pressure, gripping a young black suspect by the collar, slamming him against the table. The boy's face turned slightly toward the lens, just enough to capture the defiance in his eyes before it was swallowed by fear. A thin red line of blood traced from his temple to his jaw. The frame froze, and the door behind Grady hissed open. He didn't turn. He didn't have to. Zeranin stepped into the room like he had always belonged there, not as a guest, as gravity. His footsteps were slow, soft, but every movement carried the weight of something final. Grady broke the silence. "You knew him." 01 stopped beside him. "He was my brother." The words didn't shatter the moment. They calcified it. Grady turned, but not completely. He couldn't face it fully. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask." Grady swallowed, throat dry. It wasn't supposed to go that way, but it did. Zero's voice wasn't cruel. It wasn't even angry. It was tired. Decades of silence baked into syllables. "I left you alive, Grady, because I wanted you to carry this, to remember it, but you didn't. You buried it, under rank and years." "I didn't," Grady started, but his words died halfway. Even he didn't believe them. "You didn't look," the old man said, "and that's worse." Grady stared at the screen. "It was different back then." "No, you were different." The truth was always the same. The monitor shifted. Now, a morgue report. Black and white photo. The same boy, cold, jaw slack. Autopsy note scrawled past. Internal bleeding. Ruptured vessels. Time of death, 72 hours after the interrogation. Grady stepped forward, not in defiance, in collapse. "I filed what I was told to file," he muttered. "You filed what was convenient." Silence thickened. The lights didn't flicker. The room didn't breathe. 01 added. "That file said, Resistant subject subdued with moderate force. You knew it wasn't moderate. You knew. Grady didn't respond. He just stared at his own younger face on screen. The posture, the precision, the self-righteousness. I waited, Zero None said, for years. I wanted to see if the system would correct itself, if you would correct yourself. And? Grady whispered. You didn't. Grady's hands curled at his sides, not into fists, into nothing. So why now? He asked. Why bring it back, after all this time? Zero None looked at the frozen face of his brother on the monitor. Because I'm tired of remembering. For both of us. The screen changed again. This time a series of still images. Grady's old reports. One marked corrected. A complaint filed and then mysteriously withdrawn. A statement from another officer. Time-stamped just hours before the interrogation, warning about Grady's escalation tendencies. You think this was just about one boy? Zero One asked. It was about all of them. He was just the one you left a trail for. Grady didn't argue. He couldn't. 09 stepped back. I'm not here for revenge, Grady. If I was, you wouldn't be standing. I'm here to end the silence. Because silence has limits. Grady turned away. His eyes were hot, but no tears came. Not because he wasn't broken, but because he didn't deserve the comfort. The room went dark again. A final message scrolled across the screen. Memory denied becomes repetition. He stood beneath it, head bowed. When the door opened again, 00 was gone. Grady was alone, but the room was not empty. A black folder sat in front of him. He didn't see anyone place it there, but it was real. He opened it. Inside, the complaint his partner had filed and he had shredded, the blood report he had dismissed, a photo of the restraint strap, cracked and soaked, and at the bottom, a line written in pen, not typed, "We saw it all. You chose not to." Grady didn't speak. He closed the folder. Stood, walked to the wall mount slot near the exit, inserted the file. A red light blinked. Archive accepted. No one called for him. No one said a word. But a door ahead cracked open. No guards, no handcuffs. Just an open hallway. He stood still, because sometimes the worst sentence isn't one that's given, it's one that's remembered. The room swallowed Grady whole. His boots scraped against the sterile white floor, echoing too loud in a place designed to erase sound. The walls were unmarked, smooth, a colorless void under lights that hummed with unnatural sharpness. They sat him in the center of the room, a steel chair bolted to the floor. No table, no comfort, no script. His wrists clicked into the cuffs with mechanical finality. No officer said a word. Grady's breath steamed in the artificial cold. His eyes darted to the observation window, blacked out. Behind it, he knew, was the man whose silence had become a sentence. The chair did not creak. The room did not move. The world, for the first time in his career, no longer reacted to him. For 20 years, Grady had roared, bullied, leaned into the badge with the confidence of someone untouchable. But now his voice had been stolen by the room itself, by the weight of a silence that mocked his entire philosophy. Power is sound, yet this silence sounded louder than any of his shouting ever had. Beyond the glass, the old man stood still, motionless, arms crossed behind his back, face shadowed, but posture as controlled as a seasoned general. Not angry, not smug, just there, like a monument the wind couldn't touch. Grady twitched against the restraints. The cuffs didn't give. The air pressed closer. He looked up at the ceiling, as if the white panel tiles might fracture and rescue him. Nothing moved. No camera blinked. The silence was not void, it was curated. And then, with a flick, the lights overhead burst into full intensity. The white turned clinical, blinding. An audio system crackled on with surgical calm. A woman's voice, clipped and without accent, filled the space like a knife across velvet. Subject Grady, currently under review for procedural conduct. Interrogation initiated under internal memo Alpha 6-2. Clearance level, top top secret. Grady squinted at the ceiling. I'm not under anything, he snapped, voice cracking against the smoothness of hers. I was just doing my job. You don't put a cop on trial for doing his job. The voice responded instantly, emotionless. That statement has been logged. Relevancy negligible. He jerked in the seat, metal clinking like a confession. I didn't even know who he was. He stood up in court and disrupted a proceeding? That's obstruction. The system didn't reply immediately. When it did, the voice was even colder. And precisely because you did not know who he was, you are here. Grady's mouth opened, then closed. No retort. No anchor. For the first time, his mind felt truly unarmed. The old man hadn't moved. Still behind the glass, his reflection just visible now that the light shone across the one-way barrier. Grady stared, and for a fraction of a moment thought he saw a flicker. Pity? No, not pity. Recognition. Like a man watching a lesson unfold for someone too late to learn it. Where's my lawyer? Grady growled. I want someone here. This is illegal, the speaker replied like a mechanism. No charges have been filed. You are not under arrest. He blinked, confused. Then why the cuffs? To facilitate comprehension, Grady thrashed in the seat. This is a damn circus. You people think because you've got some old ghost from the archives walking around, you can flip the whole damn system on me? Again the voice. System inversion is not required, only transparent. Behind the glass, the old man's fingers twitched once at his side. Not a signal, not a cue, more like a conductor hearing a wrong note. Grady leaned forward, as far as the cuffs would let him. His voice dropped, low and biting. You think you're better than me, old man. You sat back and watched while real men did the work. You buried yourself in files and whispered threats in rooms we never saw. I faced the street. I faced blood. I earned my damn back. Still, the glass offered nothing. The room did not reply. Only the mechanical voice remained. Subject is demonstrating increased hostility. Elevation projected. The lights above flickered once. Not an outage, just a pulse. A reminder. This space belonged to someone else now. Grady looked up again. His voice rose, but it stumbled. You want to talk about mistakes? Show me one line in the book I crossed. One statute. One protocol. The speaker didn't answer. Instead, a soft hum began, like a system booting. On the far wall, a screen lit up. Footage, grainy but clear. A hallway, dim, a man hunched, cuffed, face battered. Grady's voice echoed faintly. Younger, crueler. No one's watching. Let's make this simple. The clip cut. Another began. A different room. A metal chair again. But this time the man seated wasn't Grady. Grady swallowed hard. His past had just walked into the room, wearing no disguise. He turned toward the glass again, voice shaky. You set me up. The old man didn't blink. Through the glass, his presence felt seismic. No, the woman's voice responded. You wrote this story yourself. We are merely turning the page. Grady slumped. The steel behind his back suddenly felt molten. The room didn't care about his shame. It didn't need to. His head dropped forward, sweat forming at his brow. I was trying to hold the line, he murmured. And in doing so, the voice concluded, you redrew it in your image. The lights dimmed slowly, not all the way, but just enough for the glass to become a mirror. Now, Grady could see himself, disheveled, cuffed, cornered, not the enforcer, not the gatekeeper, but a relic locked inside the system he helped build. From the other side, the old man watched without judgment. It was not vengeance, it was consequence. And the room, with its silence, with its absence of interrogation, had said all it needed to say. Grady, for the first time in decades, had nothing left to answer. The silence Grady had drowned in became fuel. It didn't end when the door unlocked or when his wrists were unshackled. The silence followed him, clung to his skin like cold sweat, a reminder that power, real power, no longer wore a badge. It echoed as he was walked down the long concrete hall, and seated in a room not unlike the one he had once lorded over. But this room held no fear for him now, only judgment. The city's administrative building had rarely seen a gathering like this. Oak panels lined the walls, the seal of the state embossed in gold behind the dais. High-ranking officials filled the rows. District attorneys, police chiefs, political delegates, each one wrapped in tailored suits and uncomfortable truths. At the head of the table sat a man with thinning gray hair and a voice known for ending careers. Across from him, calm and coiled, stood the FBI's lead representative, Special Counsel Elena Ward, her black blazer crisp, her words sharper than protocol. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't offer pleasantries. She began with a statement so clinical, so surgically framed, it might as well have been carved into granite. What took place inside courtroom 4B last Tuesday was not an operational anomaly. It was the symptom of a systemic illness. The room stilled. No one looked surprised, but now they had to look accountable. Elena pressed a key on the table panel. The screen behind her lit up with courtroom footage. Grainy but uncut, Grady's voice, full of contempt, snapped across the silence. I learned law where no black man stood up in court and talked nonsense. Gasps. Throats cleared. A few faces turned away. The video jumped. Grady dragging the old man. Voices raised. Authority misused like a weapon. Then it paused on the moment the old man uttered, "You just misquoted Section C of the 1994 Health Statute." That sentence, in its softness, silenced the courtroom again. Elena turned from the screen. Her voice lowered. This was not the first incident. It is, however, the first that wasn't buried under paperwork, misfiled footage, or procedural camouflage. From the end of the table, a state commissioner leaned forward. His tone was lacquered with bureaucratic detachment. "So, what is it you want from us, Special Counsel? Disciplinary action? Department reform?" She didn't blink. "You misunderstand. This isn't a request." A murmur stirred the chamber. Elena leaned forward slightly. "This isn't about what we want. It's about what the public now sees, and what they will no longer ignore." One of the deputy mayors, older, skin stretched tight across an anxious jawline, scoffed, "You're going to let one incident dictate our entire justice structure?" Elena's gaze cut clean through him. "If it were one, you wouldn't be here." She clicked the screen again. A montage. Cases dismissed without due process. Excessive force filings flagged and forgotten. Internal memos digitally time-stamped but never acknowledged. Names. Faces. Some victims spoke in the clips. Others were silent. File photos of the dead. The district police chief's knuckles whitened as he folded his hands. "So, you're saying our officers are corrupt?" "No," Elena said, voice edged with the kind of precision honed in deep briefings and deeper scars. "I'm saying the culture you defend protects corruption as a feature, not a flaw." Gasps sharpened. The room divided. Not by title, but by conscience. A younger councilwoman shifted in her seat, eyes fixed on Elena. "Then who enforces the correction?" Elena didn't hesitate. "The people, because they are done waiting." Her words fell like a gavel. No thunder, just wait. Someone at the far end, the city's director of justice affairs, leaned into his microphone. His voice was calm, almost cordial. "You've painted us into a corner, Counsel Ward. What you're implying, it's an indictment of institutional legacy." She nodded slowly. "Yes, and the legacy has been allowed to grow unchecked, like rot behind painted walls." The room chilled. Everyone knew someone in that footage. A cousin, a former colleague, a name from an email thread that suddenly didn't feel so buried. Another clip began to play, the arrest scene from courtroom 4B again, but from a different angle. No dialogue, just the old man standing still, untouched by the chaos around him. He looked not triumphant, but tired, yet in that stillness was more command than any uniform in the room. The commissioner spoke again, slower this time. "What happens now?" Elena clicked off the footage. The screen went black. She didn't sit. She didn't smile. "We stopped pretending this is theoretical." Outside the building, news vans gathered. Inside, No one dared raise their voice, and somewhere down the chain, in precincts and offices and corridors, where whispers always traveled faster than memos, the reckoning had already begun. Because this wasn't just about Grady. This was about everything he represented, and the silence that once protected him had turned into a mirror, reflecting an entire system that could no longer deny what it saw. The verdict was never spoken. It didn't need to be. The silence that had once belonged to shadowed rooms and locked chambers now stood center stage, heavy as marble. Grady entered the hearing room like a man walking into his own eulogy. The air didn't shift. The eyes didn't flinch. Yet somehow he felt the temperature of every stare. No chairs scraped. No shoes shuffled, just the dull thud of his boots on polished tile, each step echoing with a verdict already rendered. On the long table draped in state blue, 3 items were neatly placed: his badge, his sidearm, and his department ID. Each sat in isolation, like relics of a faith now lost. A supervisor read from a card. The voice was bland, civil, deliberately drained of heat. Effective immediately, pursuant to review findings and internal agreement, Officer First Class Raymond Grady is relieved of duty. Credentials are hereby revoked. Equipment is to be surrendered. No applause. No voice raised in pity, only process. Grady's fingers didn't tremble, but they slowed. The badge came off first. Not tossed, not slammed. He placed it down like a weight he'd carried too long. Then came the firearm, its cold steel clicking against the surface. Finally, the ID. His name, his rank, the photo taken years ago when he still believed he was untouchable. He straightened, as if defiance could still mean dignity. The old man stepped forward. He hadn't spoken in the entire proceeding. He hadn't needed to. Presence had done what argument never could. His posture was quiet steel, his eyes twin wells of storm-contained gravity. No glee, no triumph, just resolution. He looked at Grady, and for a moment, the silence between them threatened to say more than any sentence ever crafted. Then came the words, low, deliberate, final. Used to believe you might change, that somewhere under the uniform, behind the noise, there was a man who remembered the weight of right and wrong. But now, I see it clearly. You're the reason men like me still have to keep going. The blow didn't need volume. It landed with the weight of truth, aged in regret. Grady inhaled sharply, like a punch had just found his ribs. His mouth opened, instinct tugging at him to spit something sharp, bitter, to claw back a sliver of the control he used to own. But when he turned his eyes to the room, he saw it. No one moved. No one looked away. No one looked at him. They weren't ignoring him. They were witnessing his erasure. The erasure of a myth he built around fear and routine, around control mistaken for order. That silence, more vicious than accusation, more violent than dismissal, cut cleaner than any tribunal. He found his voice, rough and wrong. You think this makes you better? No answer. He gestured toward the table. Stripping a man down doesn't make you just. It makes you cowards. You needed him, this ghost, to speak so you could grow a spine. Still nothing. Only the sound of a pen being tapped softly. A woman on the panel crossed her arms without blinking. The old man stepped closer. His shoes made no noise on the floor. When he stood within arm's reach, the atmosphere thickened. I don't need to be better, he said, calm as stone. I need to be remembered. And so do the names that died under men like you. Grady's shoulders faltered. His hand twitched near the weapon already surrendered. Not out of threat, but from a muscle memory, too slow to admit it was useless now. The panel leader, a man in his 60s with an expression carved out of protocol, finally broke the quiet. His voice was flat. Officer Grady, you are dismissed. Not fired, not terminated, dismissed. He stood there for a beat longer. waiting, hoping maybe that someone would shift. Someone would mutter about due process or misplaced zeal, but the silence held. Grady turned. The door creaked slightly. That was the only sound the room allowed him to take with him. Behind him, the old man remained standing. He did not smile. He did not speak again. But the absence of farewell was its own kind of judgment. And in that room, stripped of applause, stripped of fear, Grady became exactly what he had always denied: expendable. The badge, once polished and preened, now lay flat under the sterile light, cold as the silence that buried it. The silence of the badge left behind had barely settled when a new chamber summoned its voice. This time, it wasn't a backroom tribunal or an internal review dressed in shadows. This was open, public, and recorded. A courtroom, the same institution that had once tried to smother the voice of the nameless man, now called him to speak. The walls were familiar but had changed. Polished mahogany still lined the benches. The seal above the judge's head still bore the same Latin promise of justice. But the mood was not routine. It was of reckoning. A young attorney, not yet hardened by compromise, stood before the bench. His voice, steady though fresh, echoed with sharpened urgency. "Your Honor, I submit that what occurred in courtroom 4B was not merely a breach of conduct. It was an exposure, a glimpse into how deeply cultural bias has embedded itself into the procedural DNA of law enforcement." A ripple moved through the room. The defense team scoffed audibly. One of them, an older man with silver hair and thinly veiled disdain, leaned back in his chair. His smirk was the kind polished over decades of making systemic cruelty sound like strategy. "Your Honor, are we now prosecuting feelings instead of facts?" The judge did not respond. Instead, he turned to the witness box, where the old man sat. He had not changed. The same composed presence. The same eyes that seemed to carry entire generations behind them. His hands were clasped gently, his posture upright without tension. He wore no badge, no uniform, no title. And yet, the room leaned toward him like gravity. The young attorney gestured. "Sir, you were there. You witnessed what happened." The old man nodded once. The attorney hesitated, as if understanding that what would be said next might outlive them all. "Why did you speak that day?" The old man's eyes moved slowly across the courtroom, not scanning, seeing, absorbing, measuring the weight of his words before he released them. And then he said, clear and without ceremony, "Not because I was the one being silenced, but because there were 100 others who never got to stand up that day." It was not a testimony. It was not even a sentence. It was a truth carved out of silence. The courtroom froze. Even the defense, with all their prepared objections and procedural shields, could not move fast enough to undercut it, because this was not an accusation, it was memory. And memory cannot be cross-examined. The young attorney continued, but his voice had changed. It had become steadier, as though he were no longer alone. "Your Honor, the presence of this witness is not to embellish a narrative. It is to anchor it. The law did not fail on its own. It was bent by people, protected by culture, justified by habit." The old man did not interrupt. He did not need to. His presence validated every word. Like a seal, no one had the authority to challenge. The defense stood. "This is anecdotal. It is emotional theater dressed in legal robes." The judge lifted one hand, not for silence, but for a pause. Then he turned again to the witness. "Sir, do you believe the law still serves justice?" The old man looked straight ahead. His tone held no venom, no heat, only clarity. "The law is a tool, but too many have used it like a weapon, and when weapons are praised long enough, people forget they were meant to protect, not destroy." The courtroom was still. No gavel struck, no recess was called, because this was not the kind of testimony that needed validation. This was history speaking through a man who had once been told he did not exist in any system at all. And now, with no title, no gun, no badge. He was louder than anyone who'd ever held them. The voice faded, but its echo remained, a quiet aftershock in the bones of the courthouse. Miles away, in a precinct no longer filled with barked orders and the smell of burnt coffee, a lone security officer made his rounds. The building was scheduled for decommissioning, stripped of relevance, its desks cleared, its hard drives wiped. But history has a way of hiding where it knows the future will come looking. His flashlight beam skimmed over old lockers, peeled posters, and cracked bulletin boards. Nothing urgent, nothing valuable. But as he turned the last corner of the east wing, something broke the rhythm. A chair, metal-framed, bolted to the floor, standard issue, sat beneath a flickering light, forgotten at the end of a narrow corridor. Something underneath it caught his eye. It was wedged tight, folded and yellowed, the edges curled like fingers too long clenched. The officer crouched, pried it free, and unrolled what turned out to be a single-page memo, unmarked by any current department logo, typed on a machine, not a keyboard. The font was crisp, mechanical, and carried the age of permanence. Across the top, in bold block letters, the heading read, Operational Review, Charleston 2006, Suppressed Incident. Beneath it, a name stood out, typed, then scratched out with deliberate ink. The officer's breath hitched. But even beneath the violent red line, meant to erase him, the letters still whispered through, 011. His hand ran down the page, pausing at each section like a scavenger tracing a relic. There were coded entries, unauthorized surveillance logs active, field contact terminated prematurely, civilian fatality unreported, then one line that held his gaze. Field coordinator, internal oversight, alias Z1. The ink here had faded, but the message cut through. A man without a name, yet inside every operation, present in absence. Ghost by choice, not by failure. At the very bottom of the page, in handwriting heavy, dark, uncompromising, was a single sentence that hadn't aged a day. Communication in silence is not submission. Confuse the two, and history will erase you. The officer stared, transfixed. His fingers, now smudged with dust and old ink, trembled slightly. This was no conspiracy theory, no buried myth whispered in locker rooms. This was evidence, not in its legality but in its weight. The memo wasn't addressed to anyone. It didn't have to be. It had survived for this moment. He looked around. No cameras, no superiors, no orders. Just a man holding a page that should have never been found, a truth someone tried to erase and failed. The light above the chair buzzed once, flickered, then went out, and the room, like the system it once served, stood exposed in its stillness. Outside, morning began to press against the horizon, but here, under dust and metal and memory, something far older than daylight had surfaced, not as a warning, but as a reckoning. The reckoning lingered in the air, silent and unfinished. No headlines ran his name, no court issued a sentence, no cell door slammed behind him. And yet, when Grady walked out of the precinct building for the last time, he knew he had not been set free. He had been let go, discarded by a system that no longer found use for the silence he once enforced. The weight wasn't in chains, but in the absence of all things he once held close. Rank, command, validation. His badge was gone, his title erased, and without them, the man who had defined himself by control now stepped into a world where his name meant nothing. The door behind him closed with a sigh more than a slam, a gesture of something final but not theatrical. He didn't glance back. There was nothing there worth remembering. Outside, the morning was gray and windless. The sidewalk was still cracked in the same places. Cars passed in the distance with no awareness of what had just exited those doors. But there, at the base of the precinct steps, stood a figure Grady had hoped never to see again. The old man waited, not as a predator, not as a prophet, but as a presence too large for the past to contain. He wore no expression. His coat was buttoned high, hands folded behind him, posture straight as stone. Grady paused at the top of the stairs, his pride, still gasping for relevance, tried to rise, but nothing in his chest obeyed. He descended slowly, each step louder than he wanted it to be. They stood face to face. The old man spoke first, his voice low, not soft, but settled, like granite warmed by the sun. "You know," he said, "the worst thing isn't being arrested, it's being forgotten." The words didn't cut, they sank. Grady swallowed once, his throat dry with the dust of days he thought he buried. "I can't fix it," he muttered, unsure who he was talking to, himself or the man who now stood as his reflection. The reply came without pause. "You don't have to fix it. You just have to remember." It was not advice. It was not forgiveness. It was the final truth spoken to a man who had run out of illusions. Grady nodded once, not in agreement, in understanding. And then, without fanfare, the old man turned. He walked away with the same silent force he had always carried, as though gravity yielded for him alone. He didn't look back, because people like him never did. They didn't need to. Behind Grady, the door of the precinct remained unlocked, but it would never open for him again. The door that would never open again faded behind him, lost in the gray breath of a city too busy to mourn the quiet collapse of forgotten men. Elsewhere, morning light spilled across the marble steps of City Hall. It didn't rush or announce itself. It arrived, steady and golden, brushing past the stone columns like memory returning to a place once deemed unreachable. Inside, the halls had not changed. The brass railings gleamed with indifference. The clocks ticked with bureaucratic rhythm. But today, something unfamiliar entered. A boy, 15, maybe 16, with skin the color history once tried to erase and eyes too focused for someone that young. His walk betrayed no arrogance, only the steady measure of someone who had memorized each step before taking it. Behind him, the whispers still followed, not because he had earned suspicion, but because a quiet boy in polished shoes was not what this building had been designed to expect. He passed a mural celebrating city law enforcement, and though the figures were dressed in honor, none of their painted eyes looked like his. A janitor pushing a cart muttered something too low to hear, but not low enough to miss the word quota. Two suited interns stepped out of an elevator, laughing until they saw him, then lowered their voices as if ambition couldn't share a hallway. At the security desk, the officer scanned him 3 times. Not because the device beeped, but because silence made some people nervous. When asked his purpose, he answered without trembling, "Internship. Legal department." The word hung awkwardly, like a suit worn too early by a boy still growing into his bones. As he waited in line, a voice nearby, dry-clipped, asked no one in particular, "Do we even still do intake from those neighborhoods?" No one answered. But the laugh that followed came like a stamp across his shoulders. Yet he did not shift, did not blink, only tightened his grip on the folder, its corners now bent slightly, not from age, but resolve. Inside that folder was no pedigree, no polished letter of recommendation, only a single sheet, unsigned except for 2 words, 01, a name without face, a legacy not worn but handed down. The kind of signature that opens doors without asking. The boy had not come because someone cleared the path. He came because someone had once stood in the way of every locked gate, then disappeared before applause could find him. The boy didn't need to know the full story. He carried enough of it in the way he breathed when the hall narrowed, and in the pause he allowed before each step forward. He understood the cost of entry wasn't paid at the threshold. It was paid years earlier, in rooms filled with smoke, in reports stamped confidential, in names crossed out and memories rewritten. And though the world had moved on, though new headlines had crowded out old truths, he was here, not to reclaim the past, but to ensure it wasn't erased. So when his number was called, he walked with the kind of quiet strength that does not knock but is noticed. He reached the front desk, where a woman in a navy blazer barely looked up from her screen. "Name?" she asked. He gave it. "Purpose of visit?" "Application," he said simply. "Legal department internship." She finally looked at him, one eyebrow raised, tone pivoting from monotone to mild disbelief. "You're early. The window for summer intake doesn't open until next month." He said nothing. He just held out the folder. She took it, flipping the cover open. Then she paused. Tucked inside the front flap, more symbol than support, was a single sheet of paper, signed in pen, with a name she hadn't seen on any official letterhead. There was no title, no agency, just 2 words in a deliberate, unmistakable hand. 01. The woman stared for a moment, longer than protocol allowed. She didn't ask questions. She didn't make a call. She simply pressed a stamp to the corner of the folder, then looked up at the boy. Her voice, when it returned, was quiet. "Welcome," he nodded once. No smile, no swagger, just gratitude threaded with purpose. Before he arrived at that desk, the boy had walked through more than marble corridors and polished floors. He had passed by the corner of the building where an older man once wore the wrong name and paid the price for speaking it too loudly. The brass plaque above that wall bore no trace of him now, though for years his badge had hung on it, commemorated as a departmental success story. One day, after the hearing, someone had pried it off, and in its place was nothing but a pale shadow that refused to shine. A week before the boy arrived, another man, older, with a clipped haircut and hollow eyes, tried to return to the local precinct. Not to reclaim his job, but to collect belongings. A junior officer stopped him cold, refusing entry. Cameras caught it. The former enforcer turned outsider, standing with empty hands, denied by the very threshold he once guarded. The video went viral within hours. The comments weren't kind. They rarely are for those who've lived long on borrowed power. Elsewhere, a podcast played a clip of the courtroom confrontation, slicing out the part where silence reigned and highlighting only the stutter, the blink, the moment Grady realized no one would speak for him. They replayed it with sound effects, laughter edited in. It wasn't news, it was content, and it spread. Then there was the mural, a project once funded by the city to honor those who had served with integrity. An artist returned, with city permission, to repaint the wall. The likeness of Grady, once depicted in bold strokes and brass-toned glory, was replaced with a blurred outline. Behind it, in faint graphite, the silhouette of another figure emerged, faceless but standing tall, hands behind his back. No signature marked the change, but every passerby understood what had been said. The boy had seen all this, not in sequence, not in full, but enough to gather what mattered. He read between the edits and retractions, the silences too carefully timed to be accidents. He knew that history was not always erased. Sometimes it was buried with the hope that no one would dig, but someone always does. As he walked through the lobby, he passed a man in a gray suit who stared too long, his gaze slick with something between calculation and discomfort. The man didn't speak, but he adjusted his tie in a way that said everything about who he'd sided with before and how little he wanted that remembered now. At the elevator, a staffer in her 20s nudged a colleague and whispered a name that was not his. It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't true either, and sometimes the difference stung just the same. Yet none of it stuck with him. Not visibly, he didn't shrink. He didn't return their glances. He simply moved forward, not because the path was easy, but because someone had once walked it in silence and left no debris behind. The folder in his hand wasn't weighty, but it held the density of memory. The stamp on its corner wasn't official enough to shield him, but it carried a signal that said, "Someone opened the door once." And that was enough. He nodded once. No smile, no swagger, just gratitude threaded with purpose. The boy turned, walking past the security gate deeper into the building where futures are usually built on the backs of others. His steps echoed not loudly, but clearly, as though each one knew the cost of silence. Behind the desk, the woman watched him disappear down the corridor. She looked again at the signature. She didn't know who it belonged to, but she felt, with unusual certainty, that this paper would never be discarded, never be misfiled. It would be kept, because some names don't need to be on record to be remembered. Outside, the city kept moving. Horns blared, papers rustled, voices tangled in the wind, and yet, somewhere between the breath of old systems and the first page of something new, a different kind of history began to write itself. It didn't need applause. It didn't need headlines. It just needed one signature and someone willing to carry it forward. Time, at last, had returned to the right hands.